what is it that has happened in the last 30 years? How far have we gone down the road of disconnecting with the seeds of change and rejuvenation that are necessary to bring back, as it were, the moral economy of Islam? In my mind, I don't think it never is too late, but the forces that have been accumulating and the way in which resources have been pushed in certain directions is going to make that increasingly difficult and, in fact, problematic. It is, in the final analysis, to do with the individual, to do with whether we as individuals want to have the kind of economic relationships or set of transactions that I've described, which are geared not so much to accumulation, geared not so much to personal advancement and personal enrichment, but are geared towards creating a sense of social cohesion, a sense of mutual nexus of obligations and responsibilities that lead ultimately to a better life as well as a better understanding of what we are commanded to do. I don't want to get into the issue of riba and interest and so on. I mean, the arguments are never ending. But you will find very, very few scholars, in at least before the 1970s, who would not consider loan interest as riba. And to me, it's really a core teaching. It's a core teaching of the legacy of Islam. It is not an issue of what is acceptable and what is usurious, what is high and what is an acceptable interest rate. And finance capitalism, the way it has evolved, is a problematic area in Islam. There's no doubt about that. That doesn't mean there's no place for finance or there's no place for banking, but the way it has evolved, the way it has manifested itself, and the way that it seems to be growing is not really supportive of the idea of creating Islamic financial institutions that better respond to the demands of Islam's moral economy. And I think if you look at the world of Islamic banking, in terms of size, in terms of quantitative measurements, there's no doubt it has grown phenomenally and has now become finally an accepted element of the world of finance. I mean, it might be eclectic, it might be somehow eccentric, but nevertheless, it's part of the global financial order. But this doesn't really imply that these are the foundations of a remoralized Islamic economy. Islamic banks may provide services that are needed, may provide forms of finance that are necessary. But we all know that in the final analysis, they are part and parcel of a globalized financial world, which does not pay particular heed to the needs and requirements for rejuvenating the economic pillar, as it were, of an entire world order or entire civilization. So, I mean, Islamic banking was conceived as an alternative and as a parallel operation to Western finance. And the way it has evolved was mainly concerned, I think, to establish its legitimacy in Western eyes as a complementary financial vehicle, one that is ultimately acceptable to the conventional banking world. And no matter how much credence you want to give to it as a savings mobilization entity, or as one that helps in attracting the resources of the pious, it is not one, I believe, that can be useful in legitimating Islamic transactions and legitimating the birth or the rejuvenation of an Islamic economic life. So Again, I don't want to discuss the whole issue of pricing and how interest fits into pricing of Islamic banks. I'm sure you've all come across these issues before. And I think we all know that ultimately the issue of pricing is related to whatever happens to be the prevailing market rate, even though it's covered up in tortuous explanations and maneuvers. But it is this aspect of it that, in my mind, denudes it of the possibility, not of being a successful form of finance, but of being a critical element in the rejuvenation of an Islamic economic order. The other aspect that I touched upon initially is the issue of globalization and how that is going to affect the rebirth, as it were, of a new dimension in Islamic economic life. I believe that it is in many ways that the emphasis, especially on individual economic rights and freedoms, as an integral aspect of the philosophy of globalization, as it were, is antithetical in a fundamental way to an Islamic economic and social order. The liberal capitalism that we all now see to be the global standard is predicated on the individual acting and driven by self-interest and constrained only by law. And the entire scaffolding of the modern capitalist era presumes the individual to be the irreducible actor in the final decision. So if you look at the way that national income accounts are established, the way that they are compiled, it is to do with individuals consuming, households consuming, but it is ultimately a matter of individual economic choice. Now, it is very difficult to see how the ethical aspects of economic transactions, like duty, charity, solidarity, self-sufficiency, how does that sit with the premise that it is only through cultivating and channeling the greed of individuals or the self-interest of individuals, acting through Adam Smith's famous invisible hand, that economic activity can be optimized. So the idea that man by nature is acquisitive and predatory, and that therefore the function of a well-ordered economy is to direct these energies into a socially productive function, does not sit well with the understanding of the nature of a human being in the ethical constructs of Islam. The expansion of globalization and the way in which it's moving across frontiers, across nations, it is being championed not only by the major Western economic powers, but also by the international financial institutions that act very much as their proxies on the world stage. Now, they've had a very significant impact on how societies are organized and how economic policies are set. And it's not always in a negative way, I want to say. There has been a great deal of benefit has come from opening up of economies, of dismantling the structures of very restricted or dirigist economic management. And although the individual should not be privileged over all others, the opposite is also not true. One should not reduce the capabilities of the individual to act in an autonomous way that allows that person to maximize their social contributions. So the decentralization of economic policy, the way in which the interjection of the major international institutions into the economies of the Muslim world has in some ways made them more flexible, more open, is, I think, to be welcomed. The issue of foreign exchange and the way in which foreign exchange reserves are accumulated, the issue as to what should be the basic currency of an Islamic economic bloc, as it were. That also has gone away, and it is very, very unlikely, I think, that any system that will re-privilege bullion or gold can ever be recreated. So we're moving away from the possibility of creating a unit of currency that allows for greater economic integration amongst the Muslim world. All of these aspects, the retreat of the elite, as it were, from accepting that Islam can provide a viable and constructive alternative to the world, the postmodern world of globalization, the postmodern world of transnational corporations, and the way in which the transnational system has evolved. The elites, by and large, throughout the Muslim world, have recognized that they would rather join the bandwagon, as it were, rather than create alternatives. All the alternative Islamic institutions, from the Islamic Development Bank to the chambers of commerce and so on, are very, very weak shadows, faint echoes of their global standard, their global alternative. So the space is shrinking. The opportunity to regenerate a moral economy, I think, is being, in some ways squandered. And one of the main props of it, one of the main aspects of it, which is Islamic banking and takaful insurance, unless it has a fundamental change in its structure and a fundamental change in the way that it approaches credits, the way it approaches borrowers, I think that if that does not happen, then the possibility of recreating an Islamic moral economy, both in the majority Muslim countries of the world as well as the Muslim communities of the West, retreats. That doesn't mean that one should not look at the increasing opportunities being offered for more cooperative ways of conducting economic transactions. I think we have to go back and see what we can learn from some of the institutions that were developed here by people who were mainly in those days religious dissenters who did not really acknowledge the prevailing order. They wanted to be part of it, but they did not acknowledge its continuing supremacy. And a lot of these cooperative, community, socially based institutions that grew up here were driven by that kind of ethic. That, I think, is where the remoralization, as it were, of the Muslims in the West can take place in terms of their economic life. It is in the area of cooperative finance, in the area of community-based work, in the area of creating institutions that have as much participation as possible. In many ways, it has a democratic flavor to it, or a democratic tinge to it. We have to connect with the mass of people in ways that are outside of the normal framework of economic and credit relationships. Without that, I think you will find that the way in which the globalized order, the way in which these institutions will evolve, will necessarily preclude any serious alternative. While in the past, all the great institutions of Islam, all the great mosque madrasa complexes, all the great caravan sarais, all the great khans, all the great markets were funded by people who gave this money back to society as part of their obligation on this earth. It wasn't a process of constant accumulation and then dribbling of that back to society. That aspect of it is increasingly rare. There are very, very few institutions now in the Muslim world that are backed by the resources of wealthy individuals. And when it's done in a very parsimonious and in a very blaring way. The problems are many, the issues are many, the way in which the Muslim world and Muslim mind has been shaken has been extremely jarring. But without this massive effort that we have to put back into it, I fear that whatever forms Islam could express itself in the outer world, in economic life, will be reduced basically to just the shell of it. The content, the meaning would have been lost. And I think this is a great failure of imagination on the part of Muslims, as well as a loss to humanity if we don't come up with alternatives that are viable, that are real, and that are rooted in our own legacy to moralize the economy and stuff.